that would honour the result of the referendum and deliver Brexit on the 31st of October in an orderly way with a deal. This government's objective has always been to leave with a deal, and these constructive and reasonable proposals show our seriousness of purpose. They do not deliver everything we would have wished. They do represent a compromise, but to remain a prisoner of existing positions is to become a cause of deadlock rather than breakthrough. And so we have made a genuine attempt to bridge the chasm, to reconcile the apparently irreconcilable, and to go the extra mile as time runs short. Our starting point is that this House promised to respect the referendum before the vote. More people voted to leave than voted for any political party in our history, and this referendum must be respected. Both main parties promised at the 2017 election that they would respect the referendum and that there would be no second referendum. This House voted to trigger Article 50 and has voted repeatedly to leave. Yet it has also voted 3 times against the previous withdrawal agreement and for repeated delay. And so, as I've emphasised time and again, there can be no path to a deal except by reopening the withdrawal agreement and replacing the so-called backstop. While, as I stand here today, we are some way from a resolution, it is to the credit of our European friends that they have accepted the need to address these issues. And I welcome the constructive calls I've had over the last 24 hours, including with President Juncker, Chancellor Merkel and Taoiseach Varadkar. And the statement from President Juncker that the Commission will now examine the legal text objectively. The essence of our new proposal is a new protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland consisting of 5 elements. In the first place, all our actions are based on our shared determination to sustain the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the fundamental basis of governance in Northern Ireland, the protection of which is the highest priority of all. And from this follows the second principle, namely that we shall of course uphold all the long-standing areas of cooperation between the UK and our friends in Ireland, including the rights of all those living in Northern Ireland and North-South cooperation, the common travel area, which predates both the Good Friday Agreement and the European Union itself. Third, we propose the potential creation of a regulatory zone on the island of Ireland covering all goods, including agri-food. For as long as it exists, this zone would eliminate all regulatory checks for trade in goods between Ireland and Northern Ireland. But fourth, unlike the so-called backstop, such a regulatory zone would be sustained with the consent of the people of Northern Ireland, as expressed through the Assembly and Executive. They will give their consent during the transition period as a condition for these arrangements entering into force. Thereafter, the Assembly will vote again every 4 years, and if consent were withheld, these arrangements would then lapse after 1 year. Fifth, it has always been a point of principle for this government that at the end of the transition period, the UK should leave the EU customs union whole and entire, restoring sovereign control over our trade policy and opening the way for free trade deals with our friends around the world. And that is a fundamental point for us, Mr. Speaker. So under the proposals in this new protocol, Northern Ireland will be fully part of the UK customs territory, not the EU customs union. But there will be no need for checks or any infrastructure at or near the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Indeed, I have already given a guarantee that the UK government will never conduct checks at the border, and we believe that the EU should do the same. So there is absolute clarity on that point. Instead, under this new protocol, all customs checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland would take place either electronically or, in the small number of cases where physical checks would be necessary, they would happen at traders' premises or at other points in the supply chain. We have put forward a method for achieving this based on improving and simplifying existing rules, trusting certain traders, and strengthening our cooperation with Ireland in a spirit of friendship and sensitivity to the particular circumstances. So, while these proposals will mean changes from the situation that prevails today in Ireland and Northern Ireland, it is their driving purpose to minimise any disruption. And in order to support the transition further, we propose a new deal for Northern Ireland that will boost economic growth and competitiveness and set in train new infrastructure, particularly with a cross-border focus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the previous withdrawal agreement and political declaration would have permanently anchored the UK within the orbit of EU regulation and customs arrangements, and an indefinite so-called backstop provided a bridge to that vision of the future. This government has a different vision, basing our future relationship with our European neighbours on a free trade agreement and allowing the UK to take back control of our trade policy and our regulations. And we propose to amend the political declaration to reflect this ambition. Our proposal should now provide the basis for rapid negotiations towards a solution in the short time that remains. I do not for one moment resile from the fact that we have shown great flexibility in the interests of reaching an accommodation with our European friends and achieving the resolution for which we all yearn. If our European neighbours choose not to show a corresponding willingness to reach a deal, then we shall have to leave on October the 31st without an agreement. And we are ready to do so. But that outcome would be a failure of statecraft for which all parties would be held responsible. When I think of the conflicts that have racked Europe in the past, of the immense challenges that we have together surmounted, of the 74 years of peace and prosperity that we have together achieved, I believe that surely we can summon the collective will to reach a new agreement. Mr. Speaker, this government has moved. Our proposals do represent a compromise, and I hope that the House can now come together in the national interest behind this new deal to open a new chapter of friendship with our European neighbours and move on to our domestic priorities, including education, infrastructure and our NHS. So, Mr. Speaker, let us seize this moment to honour our overriding promise to the British people: respect Brexit, get Brexit done, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of the statement. But what we have before us is a rehashed version of previously rejected proposals that put the Good Friday Agreement at risk, that would trigger a race to the bottom on rights and protections for workers, consumers and our precious environment. Given the seriousness of this issue and the vagueness of the proposals so far, can the Prime Minister tell this House if and when he plans to publish the full legal text that he must submit to the EU? These proposals would lead to an even worse deal than that agreed by the former Prime Minister. The Prime Minister signed up to the backstop in Cabinet and he voted for the withdrawal agreement as a backbencher. His letter to the President of the Commission yesterday claims both are now unacceptable. Perhaps he can tell us what has changed. Why did he support it then but oppose it now? The letter makes his intentions clear. It rejects any form of customs union, something demanded by every business and industry body in Britain and every trade union. They want to ditch EU standards on workers' rights, environmental regulations and consumer standards. and engage in a race to the bottom. Deal or no deal? Deal or no deal, Mr. Speaker, this government's agenda is clear. They want a Trump deal Brexit. A Trump deal Brexit that would crash our economy and rip away the standards that put a floor under people's rights at work, that protect our environment and protect our consumers. No Labour MP could support such a reckless deal that would be used as a springboard to attack rights and standards in this country. The truth is that after 3 years, this government still hasn't found an answer to solving the issue of the Irish border and the Good Friday Agreement. Where once the government was committed to having no border in Ireland, they're now proposing 2 borders in Ireland, ripping up the UK-EU joint report from December 2017. So can the Prime Minister confirm the government has now abandoned their commitment to the people of Northern Ireland that they would ensure there is no physical infrastructure or related checks and controls on the island of Ireland? I'm sorry, I'm only quoting what the government said. Mr. Speaker, while EU leaders have been lukewarm, the response from businesses in Northern Ireland has been very stark. Glyn Robert, the head of Retail Northern Ireland, said the proposal would lead to north-south tariffs with, I quote, huge negative impacts on farmers and the agri-food sector. He went on to say, and I quote, it would also mean 2 borders requiring renewal after 4 years, surveillance in border communities without their consent, and checks north-south and west-east. Tina McKenzie, the chair of the Federation of Small Businesses for Northern Ireland, was absolutely clear. She said, all the promises of unfettered access have been abandoned. Northern Ireland is a small business economy, and this is the death knell for some of those businesses. Mr. Speaker, these plans are simply unworkable. Mr. Speaker, for what we have before us is not a serious proposal to break the deadlock. Instead, these proposals are nothing more than a cynical attempt by the Prime Minister to shift the blame for his failure to deliver. We can only conclude his political advisor was telling the truth when he called the negotiations with the EU a sham. So can the Prime Minister give a clear answer to one question? If he doesn't get a deal at the October Council Summit, will he abide by the law of this country, the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act, and request an extension to avoid a disastrous no deal? Mr. Speaker, the government's proposals are neither serious nor credible. Labour consulted with UK industry, businesses and unions on the need for a comprehensive customs union, close single market alignment and robust protection for workers' rights and environmental standards. We need an extension for serious negotiations towards the sort of deal that Labour has set out. And then let the people decide, leave with a sensible deal or remain. The current proposals would damage the whole UK economy and the Northern Irish economy especially, and would undermine the Good Friday Agreement. They would lead to a race to the bottom on workers' rights, environmental rights, and strip back even the limited protections his predecessor had agreed to. Instead of spending the last few months building consensus in Parliament and across the EU, the Prime Minister has put forward proposals he knows won't be acceptable either in Brussels or Westminster, and that would damage the UK's industry, people's jobs and living standards. Mr. Speaker, the only people who won't suffer are the Prime Minister's hedge fund donors who are currently betting against the pound and running down our fragile economy. He is doing nothing but seeking to divide and risking this country's future for his own political gain. An America First deal with President Trump The proposals are unrealistic and damaging and will, as I think the Prime Minister full well knows, be rejected in Brussels, rejected in this House and rejected across this country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must confess I am disappointed by some of the tone that and the remarks that the honourable gentleman has made, because I think that this is a very good basis for a deal, and to take his points in turn and to take his questions seriously, Mr. Speaker. He asks what is the advantage of this deal over the previous withdrawal agreement, and very simply it is this, Mr. Speaker, that the objections on all sides of the House to the previous withdrawal agreement were based on the backstop, which, as the right honourable gentleman knows, keeps the UK locked in the customs union and in the single market with no say on those arrangements. And, Mr. Speaker, I listened very carefully to honourable members on all sides of the House during those debates, and that was the burden of the House's objections to the backstop. He asks a reasonable question about standards, Mr. Speaker, environmental and social protections, and I think it would be the will of this House under any circumstances to keep our standards the highest in the world. And the advantage that we have in coming out of the EU, as I'm sure the right honourable gentleman would accept if he reflected on it, is that we can go further. And there are some things that we can now do that have been long called for by the British people, for instance on animal welfare, that I think would be very advantageous. For instance, we can now ban the cruel export of live animals. And I'm sure that he will see that there are advantages that flow from this approach. He asked about physical infrastructure at the border, and I think I've been clear many times, and this government has been clear many times indeed. The previous administration, my right honourable friend, was absolutely clear that under no circumstances will the UK institute physical infrastructure at or near the border. He raised the concerns of businesses in Northern Ireland, and of course they must be at the forefront of our minds, and we will ensure that their needs are properly looked after, and that is indeed why we have made the compromises that we have for the immediate future to protect their immediate interests. And they will, of course, he asked about unfettered access to the GB market. They will, of course, have unfettered access to the GB market, and that goes with that, and with no checks whatever. And one thing is absolutely certain about those businesses is that they want a deal, Mr. Speaker. They want a deal. I've talked to them, I'm sure the right honourable gentleman has. And I may say to him, and I say to the House, I believe this is our chance and their chance to get a deal. And I listened to what he had to say about delay and keeping this country in the EU beyond the 31st of October. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that option does not commend itself to me. It would incur another £1 billion a month to no advantage whatever. I think the people of this country have had enough unnecessary dither and delay. They want to get Brexit done. They want to get on and do a deal. Mr. Speaker, this is a very good basis for the deal. I commend it to the House, and I hope that honourable and right honourable members across the House will support it.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Welcoming indications of progress in these negotiations, will my right honourable friend agree that the overriding democratic issue is that the referendum result itself and the Withdrawal Act, with the 31st of October as the end date, confirms the sovereign and inalienable right of the British people to govern themselves, and that we need, in this country, a general election now and get Brexit done?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, but of course the opposition has many times, at least several times, rejected the invitation to have a general election for reasons that I think will be apparent to most people in this House and most people in this country. We must leave them to consider their own decision. But what I can certainly tell him is that under this deal, this country will certainly be taking back control not only of its borders and its money, but also, of course, of its laws.
Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear with the Prime Minister from the outset. These proposals are unacceptable, they are unworkable, they are undeliverable. It is all about blaming someone else, in this case the European Union, when his plan is rejected. Mr. Speaker, it is a plan designed to fail. But of course, the Prime Minister knows that. By his own design, this take-it-or-leave-it threat is yet another push towards a catastrophic no-deal exit. Mr. Speaker, for Scotland, these proposals would take us out of the European Union, the single market and the customs union against our will.
That's the deal.
The UK government's document talks about the consent of the people of Northern Ireland as being required. Where is the requirement for the consent of the Scottish people who voted to remain, whose voices are ignored by this Conservative government? The Prime Minister may have bought the consent of the DUP with these proposals, but every other political party in Northern Ireland and every other major business group are not buying it. And, Mr. Speaker, they're not alone. The Prime Minister doesn't have the consent of this House. He doesn't have the consent of these islands for this doom deal or for a devastating no-deal Brexit. Let me tell him now, he will never have the consent of Scotland. Prime Minister, why is it acceptable for Northern Ireland to stay in the single market of the European Union, but not for Scotland? This is not a basis of a deal. It is a half-baked plan from Dominic Cummings and his Brexit fanatics. The Prime Minister knows that he can't get his proposal approved, and he doesn't care. Because the truth is, the Prime Minister either has no interest in getting a deal or doesn't grasp the reality of a workable backstop. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must be reminded that he is duty-bound to obey the law and seek an extension to the 31st October deadline. So, let me put this to the Prime Minister. The proposed deal is dead even before it left the podium of the Tory conference. The Prime Minister's contempt for this House, because that's what it is, for democracy, for the people to have their say through their representatives, is clear for us all to see. This House must take back control, not for us, but for the people that we serve. So I want to ask the Prime Minister, and Mr. Speaker, if I may, I want the Prime Minister to think very carefully before he answers. And I say to him, give us an actual answer. Will the Prime Minister obey the law as required to seek an extension? And if not, will he commit today, right here, right now, that he will resign? Mr. Speaker, we will not let the Prime Minister shift the blame. You know, Mr. Speaker, it is quite remarkable, because we're talking about a Prime Minister threatening to break the law, and the guffaws from the Tory benches really says it all. Mr. Speaker, we will not let the Prime Minister shift the blame for his devastating plans for a no-deal Brexit. The responsibility for the catastrophic threat lies solely and squarely at the Prime Minister's door. That's why I want to put the Prime Minister on notice. The SNP will do everything possible to secure an extension and to stop a no-deal Brexit. So I say to the Prime Minister, be warned, secure an extension or resign. If not, the SNP stand ready to bring this government down.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would just briefly, again, I must say I'm slightly disappointed by the tone the honourable gentleman has taken. I would remind him that the people of Scotland voted to remain in the UK and in the UK single market. The best way, if he wishes to avoid a no-deal outcome, and I respectfully suggest to him the best way to avoid that would be to vote for a deal that we secure. And I think that these proposals do amount to a very good basis for a deal. And finally, thirdly and finally, Mr. Speaker, if he wants to remove me from office, then the best thing he can do is to work on the right honourable gentleman opposite and persuade him to call a general election and try his luck that way.
Damien Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of us on all sides of the House want to deliver what people voted for, want to avoid a no-deal Brexit, and want to avoid the process being strung out interminably. So I welcome the government's latest proposals. Can the Prime Minister assure me that the customs proposals for the Irish border don't involve the construction of any new physical infrastructure, whether at the border or anywhere else?
I'm very grateful I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker, to my right honourable friend who's taken a keen interest in these matters for a long time and has helped to bring many members together across the House on this question. I can tell him that absolutely not. That it does not. The proposals we are putting forward do not involve physical infrastructure at or near the border, or indeed at any other place, Mr. Speaker.
Joe Swenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister had bothered to go to the Northern Ireland border, he would know the genuine fear that people there feel about his proposals, which they see will result in physical infrastructure for the border, whether that is actually on the border or, as he euphemistically puts it, at some other point in the supply chain. His plans there have been denounced as the worst of both worlds. So, will the Prime Minister now go to the Northern Ireland border and listen to the people and communities there? Or does he just not care?
Mr. Speaker, I of course understand the concerns of people on both sides of the Northern Irish border, and indeed across this country. And that's why we are absolutely determined not to have any kind of infrastructure checks at the border or near the border. As I explained to my right honourable friend, they are not necessary. And may I invite her also to support these proposals, and perhaps she could ask her Liberal Democrat colleagues to retract their letter to Jean-Claude Juncker, urging him not to agree to a new deal with the British government.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I commend the Prime Minister's emphasis on a future free trade arrangement as his desired end state, which is what many of us have wanted all along. Does he recall that earlier in the year, when the House voted on the so-called indicative votes on a number of different options, a customs union, Norway and so on, all of those were defeated bar one? The one option that has ever passed this House, other than the withdrawal agreement as originally presented, was the so-called Brady Amendment, the essence of which was to expunge the backstop in favour of alternative arrangements, which passed the House of Commons on the 29th of January by 16 votes. Does that give him hope that this could get through?
Yes, it does, Mr. Speaker, and I'm also, it does indeed, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his point, and he's right also in his ambition for what we can do with this deal, because it does liberate us to do free trade deals around the world and to take back control of our tariffs and our customs. And I'm also fortified by, I think, the knowledge on all sides of this House that this has now been going on for 3.5 years. This does represent a very good basis for a deal, and I hope that colleagues will support it.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For the last 3 years, it has been government policy that border arrangements between Northern Ireland and the Republic after Brexit would not include checks and controls. That is enshrined in UK law. But now the Prime Minister has announced that there will be customs checks in Northern Ireland, and he has, those are the words he used, and he has entertained the possibility that Northern Ireland will never enter the regulatory zone of which he speaks, because if the Assembly and the Executive don't agree to do so, that will not happen. And as a result, he has abandoned that commitment and risks the return to a hard border. How is that consistent with the joint declaration of 2017 signed by his predecessor, the Good Friday Agreement, and the peace and stability in Northern Ireland that has been so hard won?
Prime Minister.
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right to lay the emphasis that he does on the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. And I can tell Mr. Speaker, that in all our conversations we are driven by the need to protect and indeed to fortify that agreement and that process. And I think that this deal that we are setting out gives us the opportunity, gives communities in Northern Ireland the opportunity to build on that process. But I must stress to him that he is mistaken if he believes that it will involve, that any of our proposals will necessitate any kind of checks at the border. That is absolutely untrue. Or indeed any kind of hard border, because that is, I must tell him respectfully, that is untrue.
Sir Graham Brady.
Mr. Speaker, given that this proposal meets the terms set out in the amendment that was passed in this House on the 29th of January, can I urge the Prime Minister to go to his EU colleagues with some confidence and to tell them that there is every likelihood, if not certainty, that this proposition will command the support of the House of Commons and can take us forward and break the deadlock that has been dogging us for so long?
I congratulate my right honourable friend, because it was, after all, his amendment that went to the heart of what I think the House saw as the fundamental problem with the previous withdrawal agreement, and these proposals do indeed address those concerns, and I hope that right honourable members will get behind them.
Anna Soubry.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you will have observed that the Prime Minister's predecessor, at least to her credit, got things in the right order. She got an agreement with the European Union that did command support, it has to be said, in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister, but she couldn't get it through this place, thinks he's got the support of Parliament, but he hasn't got any support from the European Union, and he hasn't got the support of the people of Northern Ireland. So I congratulate him on getting a deal with the ERG and the DUP. But I remind him that the DUP do not represent the people of Northern Ireland. And I observe they can't even be bothered to turn up today. Could the Prime Minister confirm that not one single other political party or any organisation in Northern Ireland supports his con of a so-called deal?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure I was expecting support from the right honourable lady this afternoon, but I had hoped that she would see the advantages of what we're proposing. I do think that it offers a way forward both for the UK and for Ireland and for all communities in Northern Ireland, and it offers a security and stability, and above all, it protects the Good Friday process and a frictionless border. So I hope that it will have her support, Mr. Speaker.
Philip Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I launched the Better Off Out group in Parliament back in 2006, I could always rely on the now leader of the Labour Party. I could rely on him to vote for my proposals in the voting logs. I'm sorry he's now ditched the only popular policy he ever believed in. Can I ask the Prime Minister whether or not what he's proposed is a final offer to the European Union, and that if they reject his offer out of hand, that it will be the policy of the government to leave the European Union without a deal?
Yes, well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I cannot account for the unaccountable. I can't account for the right honourable gentleman opposite's change of mind on the EU, except he seems to have been captured, as I've observed before, by some of his colleagues. But I can certainly confirm to my honourable friend that we will be leaving on October the 31st, deal or no deal.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's proposals prove quite clearly that he does not understand Northern Ireland. While the Prime Minister is perfectly happy, it seems, to dance to the tune of his friends in the Democratic Unionist Party, he forgets or he chooses to ignore the fact, and it is a fact, that the DUP does not represent the majority of people in Northern Ireland. The DUP campaigned for leave, along with the Right Honourable Gentleman. But the majority of people in Northern Ireland voted Remain. The majority of people in Northern Ireland will be extremely concerned by the proposals that he has tabled yesterday and spoken to today, which introduce two borders in Northern Ireland. And may I remind the Prime Minister that the people in Northern Ireland certainly do not want the UK to leave the EU without a deal. What people in Northern Ireland really want, all of them, is to continue to enjoy the peace and stability delivered by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. I want the Prime Minister to go through the statement he has delivered and pinpoint to the House and the people of Northern Ireland the aspects of his proposals which guarantee peace and stability in Northern Ireland.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady, and I should say the most important thing is that we will abide by every the clause and principle of the Good Friday Agreement. Above all, there will be no border, there will be no hard border at all in Northern Ireland, and most importantly, we will be governed by the principle of consent. And I am more than happy to meet with the Right Honourable Lady to discuss exactly what I mean, if that would be useful to her, because I do accept that these proposals deserve wider circulation and wider explanation. I'd be more than happy to meet with the Right Honourable Lady to go through them.
Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the tone that the Prime Minister has taken today and the way in which he's answered questions, which fulfills what was my aim when I supported the recent withdrawal bill, which was to encourage the government to pursue a deal as by far the best option going forward in the future. Can I say to him that it's clear that it is unlikely that every part of his proposals are going to be fully accepted. But can I draw the House's attention to the phrase in his letter to Jean-Claude Juncker yesterday, which says, the letter sets out what I regard as a reasonable compromise, the broad landing zone in which I believe a deal can begin to take shape. Does his tone and style today suggest that the compromise that he's been able to put forward has not yet finished, and if there are needs to handle some of the difficult issues that have been raised, he is still open in that frame of mind to take this forward, because a deal would now seem to be achievable if that tone is continuing?
Well, of course, my right honourable friend is right in what in his surmise about our intentions. But I think perhaps for the benefit of the House and for people watching, people should be reminded that what the UK has done is already very considerable. We have already moved quite some way, and I hope that our friends and partners across the Channel do understand it, and I hope that my right honourable friend understands that as well. We have gone the extra mile. What we are doing both on agri-foods and on goods, with the principle of consent, is, I think, a very considerable move towards compromise.
Hey, Cooper.
Well, the Prime Minister agreed to give evidence to the Liaison Committee before the European Council on this. And can he also confirm that he's proposing to remove the provisions in Article 4 of the Annex, in particular the commitment not to reduce fundamental rights at work, occupational health and safety, fair working conditions and employment standards? So can he confirm that Far from increasing workers' rights and the protection from workers' rights, as many on this side have urged him to do, he is in fact proposing to reduce the protection for workers' rights and making it easier for Conservative governments to do what they've always done and cut workers' rights.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady is, I think, in error if she thinks that that's our intention. We are going to be ensuring that this country has the highest standards for workers' rights and for environmental protections, and I'd be more than happy to meet the Right Honourable Lady to explain what we're going to do.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister on the serious intent and effort that he's adopting with regards to these negotiations? He is proving many of his doubters wrong. And does he agree with me that the constructive tone that we heard overnight from EU counterparts stands in stark contrast to the tone adopted by the opposition? They continue to set their face against their own voters.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thoroughly agree with my right honourable friend, and I hope that all colleagues on all sides of the House will think very carefully about the terms of the deal that we're setting out. I'm more than happy, as I've said, to discuss them and to explain what we're trying to do, but I think it is incumbent on all of us to get this thing done, get it over the line. I think that is what the overwhelming majority of our electorate want us to do. Whether they voted Leave or Remain, people want us now to speak up for democracy.
Ben Bradshaw.
Breaking the Good Friday Agreement, risking 20 years of peace, creating 2 new hard borders and a smuggler's paradise in Northern Ireland, and scrapping all of the labour regulations, environmental standards and other standards in the rest of the United Kingdom. This is nothing like what he peddled to the voters in 2016, is it? So why is he scared of putting this back to the people for their consent in a referendum?
Mr. Speaker, I think that is. I don't wish to be unnecessarily adversarial today, but it seems a satirical thing for the party opposite, the gentleman opposite, to say when that party is refusing to concede to a general election. We are very happy with. I'm very happy to discuss these ideas with the honourable gentleman. They in no way correspond to the caricature that he just put to the House. This is a very serious way forward, and it gives this country the opportunity to improve our environmental and social welfare standards.
James Brokenshire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I commend my right honourable friend on his clear intent to securing that we leave with a deal on the 31st of October. He has set out a detailed and considered proposal, and despite the protestations of the party opposite, I hope that the EU will engage with them constructively. In this context, he will feel as keenly as I do the continuing absence of a fully functioning Northern Ireland executive. What further steps will he take to get Stormont back up and running? And what assurance can he give to the people of Northern Ireland on the absolute need for political decision-making in its absence?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend has a wealth of experience in this matter and did a huge amount of good both for Northern Ireland and in the cause of trying to get Stormont up and running again. Clearly what this deal would offer is the opportunity for the Executive and Assembly of Northern Ireland, the people of Northern Ireland, to have even more of a say in their own destiny. And in that sense, it takes forward and builds on the peace process, one of the great achievements of the last 30 years. So I think that it's full of hope for the people of Northern Ireland, but in my view it gives them an extra incentive to get Stormont up and running, and I can assure him that we are working very hard to do just that.
Rangfield.
May I welcome the Prime Minister's statement? May we have a vote on it before he goes to the European Summit? And would he, in the political declaration, affirm what he said to the House, that this country will be a leader in protecting workers' rights, consumer rights and the environment?
Yes, well, I'm really grateful to my right honourable friend, and I hope that he speaks for many colleagues across the House in wanting to get this thing forward. I will reflect on what he said about having a vote on it. I think it would probably be better to get a deal first. I'm confident that we can get one, and I hope it will command the support of others. And I can certainly reassure him on his point about standards. So for workers' rights and for the environment, it is the intention of this government to go higher still.
David Gork.
The publication of specific proposals to deal with the backstop is to be welcomed. The Prime Minister's commitment to not having physical infrastructure in Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland is also to be welcomed, and the Prime Minister's commitment to the Good Friday Agreement is to be welcomed. But could the Prime Minister say a little bit more about what obligations he believes we have under the Good Friday Agreement to ensure that not only is there no physical infrastructure, but that goods can flow freely between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland?
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and of course what this offer does is take one step further in, by consent, having regulatory alignment for goods as well, so obviating, Mr. Speaker, the need for checks on perhaps 30% of the traffic north-south, in addition to the 30% that we've already achieved by sanitary and phytosanitary alignment, always assuming that consent were to be granted, if he understands me.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr. Speaker, the principle of consent requires people to be able to weigh up the risks and the benefits of the actual deal as opposed to the promises that were made during the referendum. I'm afraid there are many detailed questions arising out of the Prime Minister's statement, and they can't be answered in this format. So can I ask the Prime Minister when he will keep the clear commitment he gave to appear before select committee chairs at the liaison committee, and will he do so before Parliament prorogues?
Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely committed to appearing before the Honourable Lady's committee, and she will have an answer within an hour of my departure from the chamber this afternoon.
Dr. Greg Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most people in this House and the country want to have a good deal with the EU. So can I welcome very much the pragmatic approach and the demeanour that my right honourable friend has taken today, and look to our European neighbours, and I might say the Leader of the Opposition, to respond in kind. He set out a new Northern Ireland protocol, which would kick in if and only if we have not yet concluded a free trade agreement. So can I ask my right honourable friend, is it his expectation that should the protocol be needed, it would be intended to be temporary? And is it also his expectation that it would involve zero tariffs between the UK and the EU?
The answer to both questions is in the affirmative, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my right honourable friend for his constructive attitude to this, and if there are any more details that he needs to establish from me, Mr. Speaker, I'm only too happy to share them.
Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With regard to the regulation of goods side of this, not the customs, the regulation of goods, the government's explanatory note says that these arrangements must receive the endorsement of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and executive paragraph 13 of the paper says this must happen before the end of the transition period and every 4 years afterwards. Can he confirm that what this means is that even if these proposals were to be agreed by the European Union, and even if they were subsequently agreed by this House, if they were not then approved by the Northern Ireland Assembly during the transition period, they would only last for a year, following which we would have no commitment to the common regulatory system that is essential for the open border.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is making a very valid point, if I may say, but the mechanism of consent is clearly vital, and we are in the midst of discussions with our friends about exactly how it should work. But I won't hide it from the House. He is making a legitimate point, but we will, I'm sure, solve this question during the discussions about consent.
Sir John Hayes.
Mr. Speaker, the test of reasonableness is one understood by legislators, and compromise, as the Prime Minister has said already, is intrinsic to all negotiations. What the British people are most frustrated about is what they perceive as displacement and dither and delay. So will the Prime Minister be clear in his decisive determination that he continues to personify that spirit of getting on, getting out and getting ahead?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that is exactly what we intend to do. And the purpose of this deal, these proposals, is to get Brexit done, Mr. Speaker, and for us all to move on as a country and move on together. I do believe they represent a very good way forward for the UK. They will enable us to do free trade deals. They will enable us to regulate our own laws and our own system, and above all, Mr. Speaker, they will enable the UK to leave the EU as the people of this country were promised, whole and entire, and to protect our precious union with Northern Ireland.
Ms. Savile Roberts.
Now, the Prime Minister's blame game goes down very well on the stage-managed Tory conference platform, but I wonder whether he has stress-tested the technical details of his proposals on the UK's constitution, or did he only require the DUP's consent? Now, I note that his proposal claims to equip the Stormont Assembly with the levers to control the direction of Northern Ireland's national question. Does he not agree that this sets an interesting precedent for the Senedd to be equipped to review Wales's constitutional relationship with Westminster every 4 years too? Or does he just hope and pray that somebody will stop him?
Barrister.
As the Right Honourable Lady knows, there is a unique situation in Northern Ireland under the Good Friday Agreement, and what I think we're proposing today gives this country the opportunity to develop and intensify that. But I'm willing to listen to her pleas for the Senedd, and I will consider them closely.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe this represents a significant step towards breaking the deadlock which businesses and the vast majority of this people want to see. Can my honourable friend confirm that in the spirit of goodwill now generated on both sides of the Channel, he will negotiate 24 hours a day, exhibiting every flexibility to get a deal?
I will strain every sinew, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it was only my desire to appear before you and the House today that restrained me from going off to other European capitals and selling this project.
We're delighted to hear it. Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister not accept that a customs post that is sited 20 miles away from a border still represents a hard border, and therefore it goes against the Good Friday Agreement? Why is he willing to prioritise Brexit against the Good Friday Agreements?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I should remind the honourable gentleman that there has been a fiscal border for many years between the UK and Ireland, a fiscal border, and customs checks do not mean customs posts or infrastructure of any kind, as I'm sure he appreciates. And if he doesn't, then Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to share with him our thinking and to explain how it can be done.
Philip Dunn. Mr. Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I remind my right honourable friend that I voted Remain in the referendum. I voted to deliver Brexit in this House ever since. And can I congratulate him on the constructive proposals that he's put forward and wish him every good fortune that the EU will engage with them as they need to. And can I remind the House, and perhaps he could confirm, that existing trade across the border in Northern Ireland takes place with different currencies, with different VAT rates, as he's just been elucidating, without the need for any physical infrastructure, and customs arrangements, following the excellent work done on the Alternative Arrangements Commission, can do the same.
I thank my right honourable friend, and if I may say so, I think he speaks with the voice of common sense and pragmatic understanding of the realities that obtain, but also the right measure of optimism about what we can achieve. Thank you, and I thank him very much.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the House is, like me, is hugely impressed by the Prime Minister's attempts to avoid an Irish border, and this resulted in him creating two borders. Clearly, he is not familiar with the contents of the Good Friday Agreement. Given that these proposals are doomed to fail on all counts, and as he seeks to blame the EU for his failure, will he confirm that if he cannot secure agreement, he will obey the law set out in the Benn Act, or instead will he have to die in a ditch?
Mr. Speaker, I reject the suggestion that what we are doing is not in conformity with the Good Friday Agreement. Indeed, it is intended to build on the Good Friday Agreement, and if it would help the honourable lady, I'd be more than happy to talk to her about our plans and to elucidate her on the matter.
Steve Brine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 3rd of September, I asked the Prime Minister for some evidence of an emerging deal. You will remember it well. Last week I asked him again, and I thank him then for the outline of the detail that he gave in response to me. Today I don't need to do that, because he set out some real meat to Mr. Juncker in his letter, and I'm very, very pleased to see it, Mr. Speaker. I knew he wanted a deal, and he told me he wanted a deal, and I believe him. So can he confirm that consent in Northern Ireland lies at the heart of this over there, but more importantly, compromise over here in this House of Commons is at the heart of getting this done, and those who want to avoid no deal, like me, like him, need to now do the right thing and vote for a deal.
I thank my honourable friend, for whom I have a high regard, and I well remember our conversation a few weeks ago, and I think he makes his point with great clarity and force, Mr. Speaker. Those who oppose a no-deal Brexit, and I appreciate the sincerity of the feelings of those who oppose a no-deal Brexit, they logically really should support this way forward, and I hope that they do.
George Howarth.
Mr. Speaker, as a former Northern Ireland Minister, I'm all too painfully aware of how fragile the arrangements are. And the Prime Minister's proposal, as my honourable friend for Wolverhampton South East pointed out, are all contingent upon the periodic renewal by the Executive and Assembly of his proposals. Doesn't he realise that will only add to the fragile political situation that already exists in Northern Ireland? Isn't there a case to consider, given particularly that the Executive and Assembly aren't even up and running, putting the case directly to the people of Northern Ireland in the form of a referendum to see what they think about it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that referendums have a great history in our country recently of bringing people together. And if I may say so, I think what these proposals... I mean, I appreciate his, the right honourable gentleman's experience and the sincerity with which he approaches this subject. I do, and he's right, obviously, to raise the concerns of both communities, but I think that this offers a way forward for both communities, and it is very important that the views of all communities are respected, and that's why the principle of consent is at the heart of what we're proposing.
David Jones.
I commend my right honourable friend on putting forward these positive proposals, which merit an equally positive response from the European Union. He's mentioned the need for amendments to the political declaration, the significance of which is frequently understated. I assume that this includes the deletion of the reference to building and improving on the single customs territory. But can my right honourable friend say what other amendments he considers will be necessary?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in due course, the text will of course be made available to honourable and right honourable members, though this is a negotiation, Mr. Speaker, and you will appreciate that we have to hold some things back, but I can certainly confirm to him that there will be no reference to the improving on the customs union the way that he has described, and the purpose of the political declaration will be to set out how we wish to develop our relationship with our European friends in a positive way, protecting standards, as I've said several times, insisting on the highest possible standards in this country, but also giving us the opportunity to develop a fantastic new free trade relationship, and that's what we're going to do.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In an earlier answer, the Prime Minister alluded to the fact that he had support from business for his plan, and yet the director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium has said that the Prime Minister's plan is both unworkable and unpalatable. Will the Prime Minister point to one business that moves goods into Northern Ireland that supports his plan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've met many businesses in Northern Ireland who want emphatically to get a deal, and that is the overwhelming view of businesses in Northern Ireland, and I hope very much, therefore, that she will support them in their ambition.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I, like my right honourable friends of Tunbridge Wells and North East Bedfordshire, can I say to the Prime Minister I warmly welcome the fact that proposals have been put down and the constructive tone in which he's undertaken proceedings this morning. I'm keen to understand some of the points of detail. So I understand there's going to be a change also to the political declaration of free trade arrangement zero tariffs. Can he then confirm that he intends that those zero tariffs, which will require some checks as well, will not be at the border and will be of a nature that will be of relatively de minimis?
Yes. Yes, and not only that, Mr. Speaker, but I can confirm that there will be no checks, as it were, from NI to GB. And that's very important, I think, for the House to understand.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said some moments ago that the history of referenda in this country wasn't good, but can I just remind him that by 71% the Good Friday Agreement was passed by a referendum? But can I turn the Prime Minister to the detail of his statement today? On page 3, he refers to the regulatory zone for Northern Ireland, and he says the Assembly will vote again every 4 years, and if consent were withheld, these arrangements would then lapse after 1 year. Lapse back to what?
Minister.
Obviously, Mr. Speaker, the default position is that Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and part of the UK legal order and part of the UK customs territory, and will remain part of the UK's customs territory under any circumstances. What we're proposing is alignment on agri-foods and also on industrial goods, and that is to be done by consent. I think it offers a very attractive way forward, and I hope that the House will get behind it.
Mr. Peter Bowe.
Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister a little bit more about the political declaration? Do I understand that it's going to be changed to say the UK and the EU will use the best endeavours to achieve a fantastic free trade agreement? But could I ask what would happen if we got to the end of the transition period, and when that end would be? What would then happen if there isn't a free trade agreement?
I think in that very unlikely event, obviously the UK and the EU would revert to WTO terms, but I don't think that is likely. I think that the UK and the EU will be very keen, both parties, to strike a great free trade agreement, and that is what we will do, and that is what we will set out in the political declaration.
Graham Morris.
Mr. Speaker, more than a week ago, the Prime Minister told the House, in response to a question from my good and honourable friend, the member for Ashfield, that he would publish the previous EU withdrawal bill within days. Now, that's important because it could form the basis, with amendments, to move forward and break the deadlock, amendments on workers' rights, health and safety and environmental standards. So will the Prime Minister honour that commitment and publish the bill?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will of course publish the legislation in due course.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on his statesmanship and indeed ingenuity in delivering an offer that's serious and credible, and if my emails are any to go by, there's huge support in my constituency. Can I take him to 1B of the protocol notes, which makes it clear that 100% of these unique areas of collaboration will continue? Will you find time to ring the Taoiseach and tell him that there are going to be many areas for joint collaboration on community projects, on pushing enterprise and investment and wealth creation on both sides of the border?
I thank my right honourable friend, and he's here. I talked to the Taoiseach, of course, last night, and expect to be talking to him quite a lot in the days to come, Mr. Speaker, and I will certainly make that point to him as well. And it's something we've already discussed.
Barry Shearman.
Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister agree that most of the people in this country are not extreme Remainers or extreme Brexiteers? Surely it is his job, and this House's job now, to look at a deal. This is a bit of a deal we've heard today, a full look. Perhaps we should restart the cross-party discussion so that he can evade the conclusion that he has to break the law and leave without a deal. Could we restart sensible negotiations again?
Prime Minister.
Of course, Mr. Speaker. And I have a high regard for the right honourable gentleman opposite, and I remember having many useful discussions with him about higher education when I did that job. I'd be more than happy to talk to him about what we're proposing and the way it can take our country forward and bring us back together.
Oh, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Can I say that as someone who 30 years ago served as Minister of Agriculture in Northern Ireland, that both there and in the UK, the deal and proposed transition matter, and the issues will have to be dealt with whether we crash out or whether we go with the deal. So I hope we do go with the deal. I think the majority in the House. And can I say to my friend the Prime Minister, it'd be a good thing if you could arrange to rescind the withdrawal of the Conservative whip from those of my colleagues who should be back on our side fully.
Mr. Speaker, I defer to my right honourable friend for his long-standing experience in Northern Ireland, but I think that the agreement that we have, or the deal that we're proposing, is a very good one for Northern Ireland. And as for his suggestion on our colleagues, all I can say is that the consequences of the Surrender Act, and I use that term advisedly, are very serious for our ability to negotiate, and I hope very much that, notwithstanding those difficulties, this House will come together and get a deal over the line. That is if I may say so, that if to bring the whole country together and to bring this House together, I think that would be the best way forward.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has spoken a number of times about consent, but I would urge him, particularly the only representative we have here in this House at the moment speaking for Northern Ireland is the Honourable Lady for North Down, and I would urge him to listen very carefully to what she said, because he talks about consent. It is very clear this morning that there is not consent from many of the other parties in Northern Ireland, many people across the different communities, nor from the business community, nor from Dublin and from the Irish government. So I'd urge him to listen very, very carefully to that. There is a very simple way through this, and that is to put a credible deal back to the people, including the people of Northern Ireland, for a confirmatory vote. And I urge him to look at that very closely. And will he confirm how his proposals are in line with Section 10(2) of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018? Because I do not believe that they are.
Mr. Speaker, they are completely in line with Section 10 of the Withdrawal Act, and I'd be happy to demonstrate that to him. But on his request for a second referendum, I really can't think of anything more divisive or more wasteful of this country's time. But if the honourable gentleman wants an election, then why doesn't he talk to his right honourable friend in front of him?
Colleagues, I'm very grateful to the large number of people who've come up to the chair expressing concern about my throat, and their generosity of spirit and humanity are much appreciated. But I just want to take the opportunity to confirm to the House that the state of my throat, which is purely temporary, is not down to the consumption of a kangaroo's testicle.
What type of testicle was it? What type of testicle was
it? I wouldn't eat it. It would probably be poisoned. And John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to hear it. The devil will be in the detail, but I very much congratulate my right honourable friend on his improved proposals as a basis for a deal. But in straining every sinew to secure a good deal, will he be resolute, not only in his intent to honour the triggering of Article 50 by an overwhelming majority in this place, which clearly stated that we would leave with or without a deal, but also resolute in ensuring that we are actually prepared for no deal? Because it is an inescapable logic that by being so prepared, it improves the chances of securing such a deal, despite that logic escaping the parties opposite.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and it's thanks to the preparations that we've made for that outcome, for a no-deal exit, and I thank my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, for everything that he is doing. That has unquestionably, notwithstanding the Surrender Act, notwithstanding the Surrender Act, has concentrated the minds of our friends in the EU and is helping us to get a deal.
Yeah. And David Hanson.
Could the Prime Minister genuinely help me? In paragraph 9 of his explanatory note, he says the traders moving goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland will need a new notification requirement regarding the nature of goods in the consignment, people sending, exporting and importing goods, where the goods will depart and arrive, and that these arrangements will not be affected until the transition period is completed. As the Honourable Lady for North Down said, that is effectively a second border. Could he tell the House how many of those transactions he anticipates each year and what the cost of that is to businesses and to the government in establishing that system?
I'm grateful. I can assure the honourable gentleman that insofar as such checks are necessary, they will be done electronically, they will be done by UK officials, and they will only be instituted with the consent of Northern Ireland. I think that's the important point. But I'm more than happy, if he would like, I'm more than happy to discuss it more with him in person, if that would be useful.
Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend and congratulate my honourable friend on his statement and on his valiant efforts to secure us a deal and get us out of the European Union on the 31st of October. But may I ask him a question which a lot of my constituents are asking me, that when we finally leave on the 31st of October, that if it were to be without a deal, there will be no adverse effect on any UK-European defence collaboration, especially in the field of procurement, manufacture and wider operations.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I can tell him that we are proceeding with a huge collaborations across the front with our European friends, and I have no reason to believe that any of them will be interrupted.
Peter Kyle.
Mr. Speaker, from the outset of negotiations, the British government has understandably had its red lines. They are long-standing and unchangeable red lines. It's understandable also that our negotiating partners in the EU would have their red lines, which they have stuck to rigidly throughout this. Today and last night, the Irish Taoiseach has said that the proposals that the Prime Minister has laid before the House today break those red lines and are unacceptable to them. In his words, it's a non-starter. Why has the Prime Minister brought before the House proposals which are simply unacceptable to the EU? They are breaking their red lines they have had from the outset. If they had done the same to us, he would be using the most outrageous language against them, and yet he has brought something here which is completely unacceptable from the outset. Why?
Prime Minister.
I appreciate that the honourable gentleman follows these things very closely, but I don't recognise, I may say, Mr. Speaker, the characterisation that he has given of the response from our EU friends, even in Dublin.
Victoria Prentice.
I hope the Prime Minister can hear the collective sigh of relief, which tends to indicate that this might be the beginning of the end.
The end of the beginning.
Will he join with me? Oh, we're nowhere near the end of the beginning. Will
will he join with me in encouraging everybody in this House to come together, whether or not as part of the marvellous group MPs for a deal?
Yeah.
And will he reach out to MPs from all sides and deal with their genuine concerns on the details of this agreement in the coming weeks?
I thank my honourable friend for everything that she does to bring colleagues together on this issue. I don't know whether this is the end of the beginning or the beginning of the second half of the middle, or exactly where we are in this process. But there is, I think, momentum now behind these proposals. And I'm not going to pretend that this will be easy, and I'm not going to pretend that this is a done deal, Mr. Speaker, because I think honourable members are right to be cautious. But the UK has moved a long way. The UK has moved a long way, and I hope that our partners will recognise that and move correspondingly.
And Clwyd.
As the Prime Minister has repeatedly demonstrated this morning, the information about the political declaration is very vague indeed, and it wouldn't protect jobs, rights or security, and doesn't seek to address the major reasons why we on this side oppose the deal put forward 3 times by the previous Prime Minister. And can he also tell us what how the European Parliament, how does he think they are going to react to his proposals? Has he had any contact with them at all? Any indication what they are feeling?
Yes, certainly. I've of course talked to the President of the European Parliament, in which she served with such distinction, and I can tell her and tell the House that what the European Parliament overwhelmingly wants is a deal rather than no deal, and I'm sure that they will see this as the basis of a very good deal.
Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows that my constituency probably had as close to a statistical dead heat of a result in the referendum as was possible, a tiny margin to remain, which was my own view. But he also knows that throughout that time thereafter, my constituents and I have urged that this House needs to come together and find a deal and go forward. And I therefore welcome what he has done today. I certainly support it as one who took a different view initially, but will he also recognise that the concern and distress that my constituents have is that there are some people, I regret to say on the opposite side of this House, who seem to rubbish every attempt at compromise, every attempt at a constructive way forward, and that frankly the country and they deserve better than that. And we should give this a fair chance.
I thank my right honourable friend, and I think as somebody, and I know that he is a passionate pro-European to the depths of his soul, Mr. Speaker, and I respect him profoundly for his desire to get on, do a deal, get Brexit done, and then build a new partnership with our European friends, which is what we want to do.
Hey, Green.
Manufacturers in my constituency operate an integrated trading model whereby they ship goods directly from Manchester to the Republic of Ireland for distribution across the whole of the island of Ireland. Can the Prime Minister explain to me how the deal he's proposing now offers them more certainty, fewer burdens and less cost, both than they have now and they would have had under the backstop?
All those freedoms would continue, and I can reassure the honourable lady that, as I've said many times, there would be no checks for our part on goods coming from the EU, that's to say from Ireland into Northern Ireland, into the UK.
Maria Caulfield.
Speaker, is the Prime Minister encouraged that, given the empty benches opposite on Monday when we were debating important Northern Ireland issues, that members have found their enthusiasm once again for all things Northern Ireland? And does he agree with me that any customs checks do not have to be done on the border, do not have to be done in customs posts, can be done at points of origin and destination, as the Northern Ireland Select Committee heard in evidence?
My honourable friend speaks with the technological optimism that I think has too long been absent from this debate. That is the way forward. I think everybody understands that. That's what we're going to bring to those solutions. And this agreement, I think, offers a way of doing that at a pace and a timescale that will reassure businesses on both sides and agricultural interests on both sides of the border.
On break.
I commend the Prime Minister for rare consistency. When he said F business, he really meant it. Manufacturing Northern Ireland has described his proposals as an existential threat and being thrown under the bus. Can the Prime Minister confirm which businesses in Northern Ireland he consulted about his proposals and which of them supported them?
All the Northern Ireland businesses that came to number 10 recently supported a deal, and it would be invidious to pick any one of them, Mr. Speaker, but I won't be given any lessons about consistency from the Liberal Democrats who called for a referendum and now say they want, if there were to be a second referendum, they would campaign against the result, Mr. Speaker.
Neil Parish. Mr. Barrett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement? Can I also welcome his enthusiasm? Because for 2.5 years there's been so much negativity in this House. We just cannot get this deal through. So for goodness sake, can we get the deal done? And does he believe that it will then lead on to a good trade deal so that farming, agriculture, business will not have to pay tariffs in the European Union and we can export across the whole of the world?
Mr. Speaker, and I can tell him that Somerset lamb and cattle and beef and Devon, I should say, Devon, Tiverton, isn't he? Devon and Somerset.
Although he farms in Somerset.
He does farm in Somerset.
Somerset and Devon.
Somerset and Devon, beef and lamb, will have the opportunity to find export markets which at the moment are I'm afraid, prevented by our current arrangements, such as in the United States and indeed elsewhere. And I think we have a glorious future ahead of us if we just take the first few steps.
Dr. Rupa Haaq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister is looking for ways for his proposals to pass, can I say that I agree with my near West London neighbour that all our constituents want to move on from this intractable stalemate? And can I say to him that I would allow the final version of his deal through if it came, along with many people on this side and many on that side, some of him that he's kicked out of his own party, possibly even his own brother, if it came subject to a confirmatory referendum, disentangled from all the election gimmickry, and then allow them to have the final say. If it's as fantastic as he says, he has nothing to fear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I say that I warmly welcome the first half of the Honourable Lady's question.
Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we now glimpse the possibility of a tolerable deal, and I congratulate my right honourable friend on what he's done to make that possible. But can he just reassure me that he's going to be able to make progress towards that advanced free trade agreement which we've both so long wanted to achieve, despite the Surrender Act, which people have voted for opposite?
It is with no little sense of relief, Mr. Speaker, that I listened to my honourable friend, though he and I have talked a lot in the last few days, and I knew that was broadly his view. This is an opportunity to get this done, to do it in a way that I think satisfies all the requirements that we have set out, above all the peace process in Northern Ireland, but also allows the whole of the UK to take back control of our tariffs and our customs and to do free trade deals around the world in exactly the way that he has described and he has campaigned for so many years.
Sir Leslie.
Well, the Prime Minister is clearly trying his best to placate members on his own side, but please stop the pretence that this is a proposal for anything other than a hard border on the island of Ireland. Well, tariffs, checks, inspections, a customs frontier, these are not compatible. They're not compatible with the Good Friday Agreement. I really don't know who he thinks he's kidding. This is too important, too much is at stake for him to just brush aside the consequences purely for the party political interests of the Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the former Shadow Treasury Minister should know that there already is a fiscal border in Northern Ireland, and far from adding to checks, what we are doing, as he will understand, and I think the House understands today, is making a very considerable move forward by saying that we will allow by consent regulatory alignment both for sanitary and phytosanitary goods and agri-foods and also for industrial and manufacturing goods. That is a pragmatic way forward. We're doing it by democratic consent. I think it's a method of solving the issue that should commend itself to moderate opinion on all sides of the House.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the referendum, the Right Honourable Gentleman held out the prospect of frictionless trade with the European Union. Whatever else one says about these proposals, and I think he's acknowledged this, this is not frictionless. What are the reasons why it hasn't been possible to deliver what was promised?
Mr. Speaker, this will be frictionless trade at the frontier. There will be no borders, there will be no checks, there will be no customs checks at the frontier. But of course, there may be de minimis customs checks, but not at the frontier and with no physical incarnation or physical infrastructure. And I think he's raising a very important point, because as the UK comes out of the EU and as we go to a zero tariff, zero quota free trade deal, it will also be incumbent on us to use this experience that we're going through now as we develop our relations with the EU as a whole, and as we develop the systems, the frictionless systems by which UK-EU trade will continue to operate.
Buzz Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been a long and frustrating journey, and very sadly, I think one that the Labour front bench wishes to prolong. Could I commend the Prime Minister on his efforts to break the Brexit impasse and seek a compromise that not only this Parliament can live and work with, but the nation can as well? Would my right honourable friend agree? The more voices here in this Parliament, especially from across the House, that express their approval in the national interest, the more powerful message this will send to Brussels as they meet for that critical meeting next week.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, and he's entirely right. And I know that he has campaigned passionately on this subject, and I know that his own voice is important in this matter. And I know how influential he can be also in reaching out across the House, and I hope very much to work with him to do that.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, how would the Prime Minister sell this potentially ruinous proposal to the farmers and shellfish producers in my strongly remain Argyll and Bute constituency, who will be able to see just 12 miles across the water their Northern Ireland counterparts being allowed free and unfettered access to the single market? If this is good enough for Northern Ireland, why is it not good enough for Scotland? Or are my constituents simply expendable?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I find that a slightly ironic question, given that it is the avowed policy of the Scottish Nationalist Party to give back control of Scotland's stupendous marine wealth to Brussels.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I congratulate my right honourable friend not only for his proposals, but his ability now to bring together all those of us across this House that wish to leave the European Union with a deal. Our exchanges today will be observed by our European Union friends, and our ability to negotiate that deal will often be the subject of, do they trust this House to pass the deal that is finally agreed? So can I commend my right honourable friend to think of having a vote in this House to test his negotiating strategy, to demonstrate to our European Union friends that we are behind him.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and as I've said before to a colleague who raised this, I will reflect on that suggestion. I think it would be more conventional to do the deal. I think that is what the Act prescribes, to do the deal and then bring it to this House. And I think that's probably what this House would prefer, but I'm happy to have discussions on that matter.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hearing the proceedings today, it seems increasingly that this is an internal debate within the Conservative Party rather than a meaningful attempt at international diplomacy. And I hear the outcry from the Treasury bench, but the reality is the Irish Deputy Prime Minister, Simon Coveney, has said this morning that they could not possibly support the proposals by the Prime Minister and they should come back with something fit for purpose. And elaborating on that, he says that we cannot support any proposal that suggests one party, or indeed a minority in Northern Ireland, could make the decision for the majority and how it would be implemented. So I urge the Prime Minister, how would you respond to that challenge if this is going to be workable?
I'm grateful to him, Mr. Speaker, and he's raising, I may say, an important point. I listened carefully to what my friend Simon Coveney had to say, and we must get the mechanism of consent right, so that all communities, both communities, feel reassured about it. And I'm very happy to discuss it not only with Simon Coveney in Dublin, but also, of course, with the honourable gentleman.
Robin Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Harlow, we've already seen the NHS Brexit dividend with a brand new hospital. The people of Harlow will feel that those who vote against this excellent deal, that it is really that they want to stop Brexit completely. Can my honourable friend confirm that once we do this deal, that we will, when we leave the EU, gain control of our tax rates and be able to reduce VAT and energy bills for our hard-working constituents?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and not only will we be able to reduce VAT in the UK, we'll be able to do it in Northern Ireland as well.
Deirdre Brock.
Okay. Now that the Prime Minister has established the principle that different parts of the UK can have different EU status, Scotland must at least be entitled to claim her place in the single market and customs union. When will that proposal be put to the EU?
I think that most people in this House do understand that the Good Friday Agreement does impose particular requirements on the governance of Northern Ireland. It is a unique situation, and as for the question that she raises, the people of Scotland had a referendum in 2014. They voted very substantially to remain part of the UK, and they were told it was a once-in-a-generation decision.
Robert Courts.
Mr. Speaker, may I also welcome these reasonable compromise proposals that we've heard today. Would the Prime Minister please confirm that when we speak of customs checks, we must be very careful not to conflate administrative customs procedures that can take place at a warehouse with physical customs checks at a border, and that the latter are not required, are not proposed in his proposals, and aren't needed even for the excise checks that take place at present?
If I may say so, I think my honourable friend has put his finger on the heart of the question, and he's entirely right. That is the distinction. I think it is very important for all honourable members to bear in mind as they approach this question. We can solve this problem through exactly the means that he describes.
Melanie on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I press the Prime Minister on exactly how he plans to ascertain the consent of the people of Northern Ireland? And not just how, when is he going to do that?
I'm very grateful, and she's raising, if I may say, the crucial question, one of the crucial questions that these proposals evoke. It is obviously now for discussion with our friends, not just in Dublin but around the EU. We do think there's a way forward. I'm happy to keep her abreast of our way forward as we go there. But it must be done one way or another by consent.
James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given his busy schedule, I don't know if my right friend would have had time to read the EU's latest FTA, which is with Vietnam. But even a cursory glance shows that the entire agreement is based on tariff reductions in exchange for market access. Does this not show, firstly, that it's fanciful to believe we could somehow leave the EU and stay in the customs union and get these type of trade deals? And secondly, is it not a reminder that when we leave, the EU will be negotiating its own trade deals, and that therefore it will be in both parties' interest to have a technological way to deal with variations in respective territories' tariff schedules?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my friend because he speaks with the voice of technological optimism, and he understands the details of these questions very well, and that is indeed the way forward for this country. There is a wealth of opportunity that will open up if we have the courage to take these steps.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has denied now on multiple occasions during this session that what he is proposing involves physical customs checks. But he has just said in his statement in relation to the new protocol and custom checks that there will be, and I quote, and this is on page 3 of his statement, a number of cases where physical checks would be necessary. Is he denying he has said that? And secondly, he refers to the political declaration. It is a declaration of aspiration with no legal force. Is it not the case that the free trade agreement he's referring to will take at least 3 years to negotiate? Nothing's going to get done by this at all.
Well, as the honourable gentleman knows, there already are some checks for epidemiological purposes between GB and NI. If there are to be new checks down the Irish Sea, they will be de minimis. They will not be on the GB side, and they will be done by UK officials. And no, there will be no new border posts or borders. There will be de minimis checks, and whatever checks there may be will be done by consent and only introduced by consent. And there will certainly be no checks on the GB side, because this is entirely dependent on whether the EU wants them, Mr. Speaker. And on his second point about the political declaration, that will chart a way forward for the UK-EU relationship that will be ambitious and positive and allow us to build a new partnership, which I hope that he will find invigorating, that he will support.
David Duquette. Mr. Speaker, I do have a question on the proposal, but can I start by countering with great respect some of the claims made from the benches opposite? Chief among them, the claim from the member for Argyll and Bute, who I thought may have mentioned something about the growth deal for Argyll and Bute that was announced earlier this week with some gratitude. But in terms of the proposals, if they were to vote for this deal, of course, the problems he described wouldn't exist. And even if in the event of a no deal, if he could maybe encourage his colleagues in the Scottish Government to pass on some of the money from the UK Government to local authorities for environmental health inspectors, that would be extremely helpful. And in terms of the... I'll get on with the question in that case. Thank you very much. My question on the proposal for the Prime Minister is, when this proposal goes ahead and gets accepted, it replaces the backstop. So come the end of the implementation period, can he confirm that will be no later than December 2020? And when we get to that point, because we've replaced the backstop, there will be no need for any further extension of 1 year, 2 years, or any extension whatsoever.
That is entirely right, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend and congratulate him on everything he does to promote the interests of Scottish fishing, where, if I may say, he shows great leadership and vision. And under our proposals, Scotland would take back control of Scotland's fishing grounds and be able to turn them to the advantage of the people of Scotland. And I'm sad to say that the SNP would hand back control of Scottish fishing to Brussels.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister is hopeful of restoring Stormont. We all are right across this House, but it's by no means assured. If he miraculously succeeds to secure a deal, but efforts to restore Stormont fail, will this government implement direct rule in Northern Ireland to enforce the measures in this proposal?
Mr. Speaker, we're working very hard to restore Stormont, and I'm sure that has the complete support of the honourable member, and he's already said I'm delighted it does.
Oh, what What a glittering galaxy of stars from whom to choose. Mr. Neil O'Brien.
Very much for the personal compliment, Mr. Speaker. The former Liberal Democrat MEP Andrew Duff, who is the president of the very influential Spinelli Group of European Federalists, has responded positively to the Prime Minister's proposals this morning. He said that they are politically astute and they represent a potential landing zone for a deal. Now, does the Prime Minister agree with me that that is both positive and also that those of us who are in this House who want a deal and want to avoid no deal now need to respond positively, engage with his proposals, rather than dismissing them out of hand without even having read the final text?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I do think there are many people actually of all political persuasions who are looking carefully at these proposals now and do see them as the way forward. And I remember Andrew Duff well, and I'm very glad that these proposals are finding favour with him.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, the world of work wants a deal to be done. But the problem with the Prime Minister's proposals are not just Northern Ireland. Moving as they do our country away from half a century of collaboration, close economic collaboration with our biggest market, in favour of a decade of economic uncertainty. But on Northern Ireland, after 40 years of war, there is peace. A terrible price was paid to achieve that. Nothing should be done which puts that at risk. And can I ask the Prime Minister a very specific question? On the movement of goods and his assertion that there will be no physical infrastructure, in his letter, reference is made to a small number of physical checks at traders' premises or other points on the supply chain. Where are they and what are they?
Well, they would be checks, Mr. Speaker, in the way that checks are already made for the purposes of invigilating trade in goods that are subject to excise at business premises or elsewhere. But they would be de minimis checks. And of course, on his substantive point about the peace process, I agree with him totally. I think the peace process and peace in Northern Ireland, and as the Right Honourable Lady next to him has already said, it is one of the great achievements of our times. These proposals are designed to build on that peace process and to take it forward.
Alex York.
Can I warmly welcome these creative and constructive proposals, and also my right honourable friend's repeated offer to meet with members of the opposition to discuss them further, because we're all going to have to compromise across this House, and wouldn't all honourable and right honourable members do well to remember the aphorism that those who insist on absolute victory risk absolute defeat?
Mr. Speaker, there again speaks the voice of Cheltenham, and quite rightly, and I do believe that perhaps in this conversation this morning, people haven't paid enough attention to the move that the UK has already made. This is a very considerable advance that we're making in offering alignment in these areas. I think it's something that members do need to reflect upon, but it offers a way forward. If done by consent, I think it offers a very positive way forward, and I think the country will understand what we're trying to do.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, he said Scotland was going to take back control of fisheries, so does that imply that he's going to devolve those powers to the Scottish Parliament? Because all of his interviews at the Conservative Party conference suggests he's intent on a power grab and taking powers and legislating here for issues that are actually already to devolve to Scotland.
Well, obviously, what we're proposing to do is to bring powers over UK fish back to the people of Scotland, and it is quite astonishing that the SNP continue to shrug off and to refuse the ability to run their own fisheries. Quite extraordinary.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's approach since he's become Prime Minister to getting this moving forward? And indeed, can I thank my right honourable friend for spending well over 500, I believe getting close to 600 minutes at this dispatch box, answering questions to this House on this issue. And I believe he's approached it with statesmanship, workmanship and a scientific approach to get things done. So, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, when I backed my Prime Minister's deal, I got some, let's just call it, fruity questions on Twitter as to how I could be supporting the deal, having always wanted a deal. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is the way to get a deal? For those who want to leave with a deal, it's this compromise and it's moving forward. And those which were quick to bounce down to the media before even the political analysts had a chance to look at it, give the game away that they're not interested in a deal and they're not interested in honouring democracy.
I think that is, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's quite likely that I will spend many more minutes at this dispatch box elucidating these matters, and I'm very happy to do so. But I think he's making the crucial point, which is that, of course, this House, many members of this House are opposed to no deal and what they see as the damaging consequences of no deal, even though, as I've tried to reassure the House, I believe we can greatly minimise those impacts. But I think it is, if members are opposed to no deal, then they really logically ought to support this as the way forward. I think it's very creative, it's very constructive, it takes the country forward and delivers on the mandate of the people.
Mr. Speaker, but the Prime Minister must recognise that this deal manages to put two borders on or around the island of Ireland, whilst at the same time significantly undermining the north-east manufacturing and exporting economy and leaving our NHS and indeed our gorgeous landscape open to the depredations of the American big business. Isn't it just an attempt to put the blame for this ongoing Brexit shambles anywhere but where it belongs, with the Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I had great pride in going to North Manchester General Hospital the other day and announcing. Forgive me. I thought she spoke of Manchester. Forgive me. Well, we are investing in the NHS around that. We're investing in the NHS in Newcastle as well, Mr. Speaker, and that is thanks to the hard work this government has done to repair the economic ruin of the Labour Party. And as for her assertion that we are somehow going to do a free trade deal with America that would expose the NHS, she is completely wrong in that. It is the purest scaremongering, and she should take it back.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend confirm a couple of things to me? The first is that this indeed is a backstop. It's a replacement backstop, but it is not the intention to have this, provided we can negotiate a full free trade agreement that would obviate the need for these particular arrangements. And secondly, that the withdrawal, the political declaration is indeed a political declaration. It doesn't have the kind of legislative force that the withdrawal agreement would have. And therefore, in a forthcoming general election, it's up to all parties to make the case for something Norway plus, Canada plus, whatever, but it's up to politicians to make that case so that if they form a government, they can indeed bring forward their particular version of a free trade agreement, free trade arrangements in the future.
My honourable friend should know that this is, of course, not a backstop, because we come out of the customs union. The whole of the UK is out of the customs union, and insofar as Northern Ireland remains temporarily aligned on agri-foods and on industrial goods, that is by consent. So there is no backstop. But he's absolutely right to say that these proposals offer the opportunity to do free trade deals around the world, and a very exciting prospect indeed.
Neil Coyle.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has recently admitted it was wrong to cut our police so much that 9 in 10 crimes went unpunished. His government is beginning to admit the massive faults with universal credit, and he's admitted the deep damage to the NHS. This unusual honesty is refreshing. So when will he get equally honest about Brexit and admit these plans would leave our country worse off, less secure, and risk the very future of the United Kingdom, and as such should never and can never be described as being in our national interest?
I think you will find that many members of his constituency voted to leave the European Union, and indeed the population as a whole voted to leave the European Union, Mr. Speaker, and their wishes must be respected. This House has voted time after time to honour the promise that we made to the British people. We can do so, and I believe, I'm absolutely sure, that we can achieve a glorious future by coming out with a deal of the kind that we're outlining today.
Michael Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Moses could have come down from the mountain with tablets of stone, and there would still have been those on the benches opposite who grumbled. But isn't it clear from today's exchanges, the grumblers are in the minority? Will the Prime Minister set out in due course some more of the detail of the political declaration that's so important in this case, and his vision for free trade agreements, not just with the EU, but across the world?
Yes, of course, and we will make sure that we set out what we want to do with the political declaration, but also with our ambitions for FTAs, and they are very considerable, Mr. Speaker.
Sarah Hobhouse.
Speaker, the Prime Minister is promising to get Brexit done at the end of the month. But the EU is not going to sink to the bottom of the sea, and as today's exchanges, nearly 2 hours long, have demonstrated, many questions are unanswered and nothing has been resolved. Rather than this being Brexit, getting Brexit done, isn't this Brexit never ending?
I may seize on that, Mr. Speaker, because I think that the Honourable Lady has it in her hands to help us all to get this thing over the line. This is the basis of a deal. It is not a deal. We have to get this agreed with our EU friends. It will not be easy. But if I'm able to return with a deal like this to this House of Commons, I hope, from what she has said today, that she will vote to get this thing done.
Immensely grateful to the Honourable Lady. Matthew Pennycook.
Grateful to you, Mr. Speaker. As with the Malthouse Compromise and the Brady Amendment, it's difficult to look at these proposals and not conclude that the benches opposite are almost exclusively talking to themselves. But taking the proposals at face value, does the Prime Minister accept that even if they do form the basis, however unlikely, for a deal, that there is no way that the arrangements set out in this new protocol can be put in place within 14 months, and so the logic of what he's proposing is an extension to the transition period beyond December 2020, with all the financial implications that entails?
I think that, if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, I think that is an excellent question and a relevant point. I'm happy to talk him through how we could satisfy all the objectives we have for the implementation period by the end of 2020, and to get to the state we want to be with our EU friends. He speaks about the need to converse cross-party. I'm more than happy to do that with him.
Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that in supporting this hodgepodge of proposals, the absent Democratic Unionist Party has stood on its head as regards accepting a regulatory border down the Irish Sea. And this can only be because the looming no deal from the Prime Minister will be a disaster for Northern Ireland, which voted to remain. So could I ask the Prime Minister, isn't it time that the people of Northern Ireland, as well as the rest of the UK, were given a further vote with a much simpler option of remaining in the customs union and the single market being on the ballot paper? In opposing this, what is the Prime Minister afraid of?
Mr. Speaker, I think what the people of this country want is their democratic will respected, and what they want is to get Brexit done. And that's what we're going to do.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, the negative response this morning from both the business community in Northern Ireland and the majority of the political parties in Northern Ireland indicates the Prime Minister has got a great deal of work to do if he is to gain the consent of the people of Northern Ireland for his proposals. And does he not recognise too that if he fails to gain the consent of the people of Northern Ireland, he runs a significant risk of visiting damage on the Good Friday Agreement in both letter and spirit.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that point, and she's absolutely right in what she did to emphasise the importance of getting consensus in Northern Ireland. But that's why we place so much emphasis in these proposals on consent, and that will be a key part of the discussions.
And Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From the discussions this morning, it's now no longer at all clear which parts of the political declaration the government actually supports. So I think it would be helpful to everyone if they could set out which parts still exist. And it's important because, for instance, the other day I was listening to the Universities Minister trying to reassure some of our senior researchers that we would stay close as possible, to the European research frameworks, overseen ultimately, of course, by the ECJ. Is that still the government's position?
Of course, we will have a very close relationship with all European projects, whether it's on research or science or educational or whatever it happens to be. And I'm very happy in due course to share with the Honourable Gentleman and with the whole House where we are on the political declaration. The objective of the changes to the political declaration is really to set out the difference between this government's approach to the future relationship on trade and the customs union and our ambitions to do global free trade deals.
Drew Henry.
Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister outline his thinking over the principle of the Northern Ireland Assembly reviewing and voting on these arrangements every 4 years? Is it because if circumstances change, they have a right to change their minds?
Mr. Speaker, that is indeed the case, as he will understand. But if he invites me to draw an analogy with the people of Scotland, I just remind him that the people of Scotland were repeatedly promised that their referendum was a once-in-a-generation question.
In thanking the Prime Minister and colleagues, I would just say that there are issues of substance and issues of tone. The issue of substance of policy is absolutely not a matter for the Chair, but in respect of the tone, I would like to say that I think that the tone of yesterday's debate, very important debate on the government's domestic abuse bill, and the tone of the exchanges today represent a huge improvement on last week. And can I thank the Prime Minister and colleagues, if the Right Honourable Gentleman really thinks it's necessary, but we will take it. But point of order, Sabita Bosway.
It's not necessary, but it's a courtesy to say we appreciate that your calm, quiet voice was just as effective as other voices you have.
Well, why didn't I realise just in advance how generous the Honourable Gentleman was going to be, and I thank him for what he said, which is very much appreciated. Minister, thank you. OK, we now come to the backbench motion on women's mental health. To move the motion, I call Vera Hobhouse.
Mr. Speaker. Constituents often come to us at their lowest points, and we listen to them going through anxiety, depression and trauma. Poor mental health affects not only the individual, but everybody around them. Women are far more likely to experience serious mental health issues. Young women are at the greatest risk, with 1 in 5 having self-harmed and 13% having been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Over the course of this Parliament, there has been a great deal of talk in this House around mental health, and that's progress. However, the opportunity to discuss women's specific needs when it comes to mental health services has been limited. 10 months after the publication of the Women's Mental Health Task Force final report, little has changed. There's a long way to go before our mental health services are working for women. There is now an obligation for government to step in and respond to the growing crisis in women's mental health with substantive policy.
Should give way?
I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful. I very much welcome the work of the Mental Health Task Force and its report and the principles that were laid out in that report. But does she share my concern that those principles aren't going to be effectively implemented unless there's some clear targets and some concrete commitments from the government, and that the next stage needs to be a full women's mental health strategy with those targets and commitments in it.
I couldn't agree more. We need a strategy. More than half of women who experience mental health have a history of abuse, meaning that their conditions are rooted in experiences of gender-based violence. And we had a very, very moving debate yesterday with many, many harrowing examples. We have a long way to go to change the whole culture around domestic violence and treat the consequences of it. When it comes to treatment, we must ensure that frontline mental health services for women are trauma-informed. There is a legal framework that we could actually use. It is called the Istanbul Convention. We signed up to the convention back in 2012. But so far, we have failed to bring this convention into domestic law. One consequence of this is that we do not have enough rape crisis centres across the country. Earlier this year, Fern Champion, herself a survivor of sexual violence, came forward after being turned away by her local rape crisis centre. She launched a petition asking the government to ratify the Istanbul Convention and has so far received 171,000 signatures. With less than 100 rape crisis centres across England and Wales, it is hard to suggest that we can lay the groundwork to effectively support women and their mental health challenges. This is simply not good enough to effectively support women and prevent them from developing serious mental health problems after suffering abuse. Ratifying the Istanbul Convention would mean that the UK would uphold the international standards of survivors' rights. Earlier this year, I tabled a bill that would guarantee a health checkup specifically for mothers 6 weeks after giving birth. Depression before, during, and after birth is a serious condition which is unrecognized, which, if it is unrecognized and untreated, for nearly half of new mothers who suffer from depression. Statistics suggest that mothers are afraid to speak up. 47% of new mothers get less than 3 minutes to discuss their mental health with a healthcare professional. Conversations about the reality of motherhood and the reality of perinatal depression are still few and far between. This is not only a huge problem for the mother herself. Undiagnosed mental health problems in mothers have serious consequences for the newborn child and its development. I've also been campaigning for better treatment for eating disorders. Eating disorders disproportionately affect women, although they don't discriminate. Women in the LGBTQ community are particularly successful. I'm very happy to give way.
Gets off the subject of perinatal mental illness, and I absolutely accord with what she's said, but she will also agree, I'm sure, with the shocking statistic that suicide is the leading cause of direct maternal deaths occurring within a year after the end of pregnancy in the United Kingdom. That perinatal mental illness can actually lead to the loss of life amongst mothers, and we need to do so much better in those early mental health checks for them.
Absolutely, and postnatal depression is something that really is hidden, and the campaign that's been done by the NCT, the Hidden Half campaign, addresses exactly that. And whoever has been a parent knows that parenthood is not easy, and probably all mothers go through some form of depression or some sort of feeling really down after birth. And I keep saying, even if anybody would have asked me, I would have probably said, oh God, yeah, I'm not feeling particularly well. And not addressing it early on where these things could develop into something much more serious is that problem. And this is why it is so very important that we have a 6-week checkup, particularly for women and not just for the newborn child.
Would you just give way on that?
I'm happy.
I'm grateful to her giving way again. She's been very generous. A number of my constituents have been in touch just on that very point about perinatal checkups. And my constituent Catherine gave me, very briefly, her experience. She said, I asked for a 6-week checkup with the GP, and this was at best brief. Physical symptoms were looked at, but nothing was checked with regards to my mental health. There needs to be a standard physical and mental health check for all new mothers. Would she agree we need to do better?
Yes, indeed. And when I'm talking to the campaigners, I think they're looking now at the GP new contracts that are going out. And I think that is definitely a way forward. But then, of course, we also need the adequate training, because you have to ask the right questions in order to finally get to a point. Because it is sort of stigmatized. Everybody thinks, you're a new mum, you should be on top of the world, and nobody really wants to admit that sometimes motherhood can be very difficult and one doesn't always feel great. So we need also the training for people when new mums come in to ask the right questions. But going back to eating disorders. Eating disorders disproportionately affect women, although they don't discriminate. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of all mental health conditions. And if we think that we've got about 1 million sufferers of eating disorders, this is ultimately an epidemic that is being there undiagnosed, untreated, and we must do so much better. Our NHS is not well equipped to stop the problem early and treat it. Waiting times for adults have been shooting up over the last few years. Outdated methods such as BMI measurements are still being used to diagnose the condition, failing to recognize that at the core of an eating disorder are a mental health, not a physical health problem. Despite the increasing public and professional awareness of eating disorders, medical students only receive 2 hours of training about the conditions and its treatment during their entire time in medical schools. These are just a few examples of where our NHS doesn't work for women's mental health. We need a strategy. The Women's Mental Health Task Force did some extremely important work, but their recommendations have been left on the shelf. A government strategy would help individual trusts make the changes required to implement the recommendations. My party has championed the fight for better mental health care for many years now. We believe that mental health and physical health should be equally supported by our services. I have highlighted a few of the areas where women's mental health provision could be improved, and I'm now looking forward to a debate and a response from the Minister. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Question is, as on the order paper, Sir David Amos.
I make no apology for contributing to this debate as a man, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I come from a household where 4 of my 5 children are women. My late mother had a big role in my life, and of course I do have a wife. And I am prepared to say that I do think women are the fairer sex, but I think by and large they do have the tougher deal in life, because I look opposite at the benches and I certainly, for one, would never fancy giving birth to a baby. And there are so many other things that women face that men don't. But I really do congratulate the Honourable Member for Bath on allowing us to debate this subject, and all the points that she made I agree with, and I just want to pick out a few other subjects which colleagues may not be talking about later in the debate. So with World Mental Health Day just 1 week away, I really am pleased that the Honourable Member for Bath has secured this debate. And as she said, reports indicate that 1 in 6 people have experienced a common mental health problem in the last week. Truly shocking. And with a population of roughly 65 million people in the UK, there are almost 11 million people who need to access publicly funded support. Prevalence of mental health is similar for men and women in the UK, but as I've said already, women have to deal with very different challenges to men. The House of Commons briefing on this topic, which I thought was absolutely superb, makes clear that the greater caring responsibilities and a high risk of domestic violence are contributing factors to the challenges which we are discussing today. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wasn't in the chamber yesterday for the second reading of the domestic violence bill. I sat in my office in the House of Commons, but I was just absolutely dumbfounded by the speeches we heard. And I look at the Honourable Member for Dewsbury, who she might sit on the benches opposite, but in every respect she is a thoroughly wonderful colleague, and she's had some terrible issues to deal with over the last few months and going beyond that. And I think of her struggle, and I hope that colleagues are rallying round to support her. And then when we heard the speech from the Honourable Member for Canterbury, a speech which the like of I've never heard before, so brave